There are some deaths the world never truly gets over. No matter how many years pass, they still feel unreal. They still feel unfinished. And Whitney Houston is one of those names. Because Whitney was not just a singer. She was a voice people thought would last forever. She was elegance, power, beauty, and emotion all at once. When Whitney Houston sang, it did not feel ordinary. It felt almost supernatural. Her voice was so pure, so effortless, so unforgettable that people did not just admire it. They trusted it. They believed in it. That is why her death felt so shocking, not only because she died too young, but because by the end, the woman who once seemed untouchable looked painfully fragile. The final days of Whitney Houston were not only tragic, they were haunting. They were filled with sadness, visible decline, and the feeling that one of the greatest voices in music history was slipping away in front of the world. By February 2012, Whitney Houston was just 48 years old. She was in Los Angeles during Grammy weekend, staying at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, where music industry stars had gathered for the annual pre-Grammy events hosted by Clive Davis. Whitney was still deeply connected to that world. Whitney was still famous, still beloved, still capable of commanding attention the moment she entered a room. But this was no longer the Whitney Houston of the late 1980s or the early 1990s. The years had taken a visible toll. Her struggles had been public for a long time. The extraordinary rise, the unmatched success, the pressure, the addiction battles, the damaged public image, and the repeated attempts to regain stability had all become part of her story. By the time Grammy weekend arrived in 2012, there was still hope around her name, but there was also concern, a painful kind of concern. The kind people feel when they want to believe someone is recovering, while quietly fearing that they may not be. In those final days, Whitney was seen in public several times. Reports from that week described her moving through parties, rehearsals, and hotel spaces with a restless, unsteady energy. Some people who saw her said she looked disoriented or exhausted. Others held on to the hope that she was simply trying to return to the spotlight, trying to be herself again, trying to rebuild one more time. And maybe that is part of what makes this story so heartbreaking, because the end did not come during total isolation. It came while she was still trying to remain part of the music world that had once worshipped her. It came during a weekend built around celebration, fame, glamour, and applause. And somehow, that contrast makes everything sadder. Whitney Houston was surrounded by the noise of the industry that had helped make her a legend, and yet her final days carried a deep feeling of loneliness. 2 days before her death, on February 9, 2012, Whitney made what is widely described as her final public performance. She joined Kelly Price on stage and sang "Jesus Loves Me." It was a brief moment, but it has lived on in the memories of fans because it now feels almost unbearably symbolic. One of the greatest voices in modern music, standing in public one last time, singing a song of comfort and faith. Looking back now, that moment feels almost like a goodbye. Not a planned farewell, not a dramatic final statement, just a brief, emotional appearance that became historic because of what happened next. Then came February 11th. Whitney was in Suite 434 at the Beverly Hilton. That afternoon, she was found unresponsive in the bathtub. Emergency responders were called. CPR was performed, but nothing could save her. She was pronounced dead at 3:55 p.m. local time. In the immediate aftermath, police said there were no obvious signs of criminal intent. At first, there was confusion, disbelief, and a desperate scramble for answers. The official cause would come later, but the shock hit instantly. Whitney Houston was gone. For millions of people, that moment felt impossible to process. Whitney Houston had one of those rare careers that seemed too large for an ordinary ending. Her voice had become part of people's lives. Weddings, funerals, radio stations, talent shows, childhood memories, first loves, heartbreak, faith, hope, longing, all of it seemed to have a Whitney Houston song attached to it. She was not just famous, she was woven into memory. And suddenly, on the eve of the Grammy Awards, she was dead in a hotel room. That alone was devastating. But the painful truth of Whitney Houston's last days became even heavier when the official findings were released. In March 2012, the Los Angeles County coroner ruled her death an accidental drowning. The report also listed atherosclerotic heart disease and cocaine use as contributing factors. Other substances were found in her system, but those were not listed as contributing causes. The manner of death was ruled an accident, not a homicide. Later, Beverly Hills police formally closed the investigation, saying no crime had been committed. That official conclusion mattered because for years there had been speculation, rumors, and theories, but the reality was tragic enough without them. Whitney Houston's death was not some glamorous mystery. It was the death of a woman whose body and life had been carrying immense strain, a woman with heart disease, a woman still entangled in addiction, a woman who, despite all her talent and all her fame, was still vulnerable to the same physical collapse and private pain that destroys so many lives quietly every year. And maybe that is the hardest part to accept. A voice like hers felt indestructible. But Whitney herself was not indestructible. No one is. What makes her last days so painful is not just the official cause of death. It is the contrast. The contrast between who she had once been and what the world was witnessing by the end. This was the woman who had become one of the best-selling artists of all time. The woman known simply as The Voice. The woman who sang with such control and beauty that other singers measured themselves against her. Her success had once seemed limitless. Her image had once seemed luminous. She represented a kind of perfection that very few artists ever reach. And yet, by the final chapter, the image had changed. There was no dramatic comeback waiting at the finish line. No triumphant reinvention. No final act in which the world got to see Whitney restored to everything she had once been. Instead, there was a hotel room, a bathtub, a coroner's report, and an unbearable silence where that voice used to be. That is the painful truth. Not just that Whitney Houston died, but that her ending felt so small compared to the enormity of her gift. It felt brutally human, a devastating reminder that fame cannot rescue a person from addiction, illness, exhaustion, or inner collapse. There is another reason people still struggle with Whitney's death. It happened while there was still hope. She had recently completed work connected to the film Sparkle, released later in 2012. There were still conversations about her future, about whether she could stabilize, whether she could return in some form, whether there was still time for healing. Even if a comeback would never fully resemble the past, many people still believed there could be another chapter. That belief made her death feel even crueler, because it cut off the possibility of redemption in real time. And perhaps that is why Whitney Houston's story continues to break hearts. Not because she was perfect, not because her life was untouched by mistakes, but because she gave the world something almost no one else could give. She created moments people still cannot hear without feeling something deep inside them. Her voice was not just technically astonishing, it was emotional truth. It was longing, power, vulnerability, and faith all wrapped into sound. So when a person like that dies in visible decline, the grief becomes more than celebrity news. It becomes a kind of collective mourning for wasted possibility, for brilliance under pressure, for beauty that could not fully protect the person carrying it. Whitney Houston died on February 11, 2012. But in a way, the world was not only grieving her death, it was grieving everything that had been lost long before that day. The ease in her smile, the security in her life, the stability that might have saved her, the years that should have still been ahead of her. That is what makes her last days so haunting. They were not just the end of a life. They felt like the final collapse of a long, painful struggle that many people had been watching for years, hoping it would somehow reverse. And still, even with all of that sadness, Whitney Houston's legacy remains enormous. The tragedy of her ending did not erase the miracle of her voice. If anything, it made people return to it with even greater emotion. People still listen to Whitney and hear something almost impossible to replace. Not just talent, but purity. Not just power, but feeling. Her records remain. Her performances remain. And that voice somehow still rises above the darkness of the way she died. But the final truth is this: Whitney Houston's last days were painful because they revealed how fragile greatness can be. How even the most adored voices can suffer in ways the public cannot heal. How a woman worshipped by millions could still reach the end surrounded by concern, instability, and heartbreaking vulnerability. She was one of the greatest singers who ever lived, and in the end, she was also a human being in pain. That is why the story still hurts. That is why her death still feels heavy. And that is why Whitney Houston will always be remembered not only for the voice that stunned the world, but for the sadness of a final chapter that came far too soon. If Whitney Houston's story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more heartbreaking stories about the lives and final days of the world's most unforgettable stars. Tell us in the comments which legend you want us to cover next.